But then he also reveals two goats in a special ceremony in Yom Kippur. And I welcome Robert Walter with us now. Welcome, Robert. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Oliver. I appreciate the invitation.
You're welcome. And you serve with Chosen People Ministries in Brooklyn, New York, there as the congregational leader of Beth Sar Shalom, the Messianic congregation, and as the New York regional director for the work. So I imagine you're sharing this message of Yom Kippur every year as it comes round. And as we've heard, God isn't shy about mentioning the problem of sin, but he's also not shy in bringing a solution. What is so special about Yom Kippur? What was prescribed there that we can learn from?
Yeah. So I think there's quite a bit that we can take away from our study of Yom Kippur, especially in Leviticus chapter 16. So I'm just going to share my screen very quickly here so we can kind of take a look. In Leviticus chapter 16, we're introduced to these two goats. And Leviticus 16, this chapter is very fascinating and important for us to begin with, because it sits at the very center, not just of the book of Leviticus, but at the very center of the entire Torah. And Leviticus 16, the entire chapter is just devoted to the details for how this special day, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, was to be observed and was to be celebrated year after year. So why is this important that it's at the center? Well, I'm glad you asked. It's because in much of ancient Near Eastern literature, especially in the Bible, we'll find this form of poetic parallelism called a chiasm or a chiasm, where the author is intending to draw the reader's attention to the very center of the writing. It could be on a small scale. It could be, the outline of a particular individual's lifespan as revealed in Scripture, like Abraham's life or Noah's life is structured in this way, where the beginning will parallel the end. The second section will parallel the second to last, the third to last, and so on and so forth, until you reach the apex, the very center. And that was, in many ways, like the hinge upon which the entire narrative would turn. And when we look in Leviticus, chapter 16 is sitting at the center. It is like everything is leading up to this. And it makes sense even when we look at the importance and significance of Yom Kippur and these two goats in the grand narrative of the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. In so many ways, the tragedy that took place and what was lost in the Garden of Eden because of our sin is reversed, or at least the outline, the template for how God intends to ultimately reverse and take care of that sin problem, that restricted access to God's presence that came as a consequence, as a result of our sin way back in Genesis 3, is that the template is laid out for us in Leviticus 16 with Yom Kippur, with the Day of Atonement. So when we look at the Day of Atonement, we really see three main themes that I outlined on the bottom of the PowerPoint slide. There's a theme of cleansing the tabernacle, cleansing the people. There's a theme of approaching the divine presence, again, which is harkens back to the Garden of Eden and what was lost there. And then there is also this theme of re-entering the Garden of Eden. Now, we don't have time to go into all the connections between the Garden of Eden and the tabernacle, and how the tabernacle is in many ways like a reflection of the outline of the Garden of Eden. Much of that has been documented, well documented. There's a book that I would recommend if you're interested. It's called Who Shall Ascend the Mountain of the Lord, which is a biblical theology on the book of Leviticus by a scholar named L. Michael Morales. Highly recommended. He goes to great lengths to talk about much of the significance of the book of Leviticus. So, but what we want to talk about here is the two goats and their placement within the flow of Leviticus 16. So when we look in Leviticus 16, we do see the high priest. We see that this is the one day in the year where he would enter into the Holy of Holies to make atonement on behalf of the entire nation of Israel. He is, stripped of his normal majestic garments. The high priest, his garb is usually very ornate. He's got the chest plate with the different gems and stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel. He's got the special headgear. He's got the headband that says Kadosh Ladonai, which means holy unto the Lord. But on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, he puts all of that aside and he puts on humble, holy, white linen garments, very, very modest apparel to enter in to the Holy of Holies, which is where the presence of God would touch down on earth to dwell with his people. Okay, again, hearkening back to what the Garden of Eden experience was like, right? Adam and Eve, man and woman, created in God's image, tabernacling with God, dwelling with God, and enjoying his presence in that garden. But again, that was cut off because of our sin. So this high priest, again, the ministry that he serves throughout Leviticus chapter 16 on Yom Kippur, so much of it centers on the ministry of these two goats. These two goats, they ultimately have polar opposite geographical ends in Leviticus 16. One of them is sacrificed on the altar, and its blood is taken into the Holy of Holies. And again, this is the one day in the year where that takes place, where anyone enters into the Holy of Holies. And it's the blood of this one particular goat that goes in there. And, I put the scripture references there if you wanted to read it for yourself. And then the second goat, which is called the Azazel, and there's lots of scholarly debate among Jewish and Christian scholars and teachers all throughout the ages on what Azazel means. And again, we're not going to go into all of that, but the important thing for us to take away is that this goat it lives, right? At least in the tabernacle. And this goat is then, after the high priest ministers in the tabernacle, in the Holy of Holies, cleansing the space where God's presence dwells through that blood, then the high priest would come out, lay his hands upon the head of this scapegoat, this second goat, and he would confess all the sins, transgressions, and iniquities. So it's the same three words, the chata, the avon, and the pesha of all of Israel onto that live scapegoat. And then another priest would come and escort that live scapegoat into the wilderness. Now, these two, again, geographic locations are significant for us when we think about Yom Kippur and what's taking place. These were likely, identical looking goats. They most likely looked the same, and it was sort of random. They cast lots to determine which would be the goat entering the Holy of Holies and which would be the one going into the wilderness. But the ministry of these two goats would highlight and focus on the purification, the purification of the temple, of the tabernacle, of the people, the cleansing of the people from the pollution of their sin, and then also the expiation of their sin. So cleansing from sin's pollution and the removal of sin's guilt. Okay, that is the big picture of and the big ministry that's taking place through these two goats on Yom Kippur. It is a holistic, God holistically dealing with the issue of sin, the guilt, the shame that comes along with it, the condemnation that is associated with our sinful behavior, but also the pollution that sin brings to our flesh and to all creation. Yom Kippur, the ministry of these two goats, is meant to symbolize and show us that God is alleviating and taking care of sin entirely, right? And ultimately, I don't want to step on Richard's toes here, but ultimately this is really pointing like a flashing signpost ahead to the Messiah. Now, one other thing I want to mention about the ministry of these two goats, as we sort of land the plane here, is the progressive flow of the cleansing, of the expiation, right? When we read in Leviticus 16, beginning in verse 14, there's a sort of a flow, a start point where the high priest is to begin the process of expiating the sin and cleansing the holy place, right? In the Holy of Holies. Chapter 16, verse 14 says this: "Moreover, he shall take some of the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his finger on the mercy seat on the east side," is how some translations have it. But really, it's more, he's to do it toward the east. So essentially, the high priest, when he takes the blood of that first sacrificed goat, he would enter into the Holy of Holies, and he would actually go behind the Holy of Holies and then begin the process from behind the Holy of Holies of spreading the cleansing blood onto the Ark of the Covenant, onto the mercy seat. And then when we keep reading in Leviticus 16, 14 and forward through verse 19, we see that he progressively goes outward. He goes from behind the Holy of Holies into the holy place where the altar of incense is, the table of showbread, the menorah, out into the outer court where the altar is. Okay, and it's there. So the progressive flow sees the cleansing blood go from really the presence of the Lord outward into the rest of the chaos, into the rest of the polluted creation. And then it's when he's by the altar, then he lays his hand onto the scapegoat and confesses the sins, transgressions, and iniquities of the people. And then that scapegoat, again, ventures further and further away from the Holy of Holies into the wilderness, that place of barren, lifeless death and hopelessness. But yet the cleansing comes to that place, and the sin is removed from the people and from the presence. And so much of this imagery that we find in Leviticus 16 and the ministry of these two goats, we find echoes of it in the rest of Scripture. In Ezekiel 47, verses 1, really 1 through 12, you can read that. But I have some of the passages here where we see this river of life that flows, this cleansing river of life that flows from the throne of God, from the presence of God, and it heads out where? Toward the east. Okay, that same direction where the redemptive flow of the ministry of the blood of that goat flows out, and the confession of the sins onto the scapegoat flows out, touching all the chaotic places that have been tainted by sin in all creation. So with that, I think we'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Robert.